So many of you here already know Moses Oketch, because he is teaching a class here already at the Graduate School of Education. And it is my great pleasure to introduce him to, however, everybody. And he probably didn't have a chance to say too much about himself when we go into courses. You just say, I'm Dr. Oketch. Let's get started. And I'm sure that, knowing Moses Oketch, I'm sure that's more or less how he proceeded. But it is my real pleasure to introduce him in today's talk, which is, I know many of you here are with the International Education Development Program, but not everybody. And that's as it should be, because in fact he is not only teaching in the IEDP program, but he's also this year's honorary school-wide global educator who has come in on a special arrangement that combines the School of Education with the Provost's office at the University of Pennsylvania, where once every year or two we get to invite somebody mainly from outside the United States and largely from developing country or low-income country to come and teach. We had a woman, some of you, well, most of you probably in the IEDP program will not know her, but she came in from Peru a couple of years ago and taught in the Graduate School of Education. Professor Oketch is the second in that series, only the second of a series that's going to be going forward, not just with IEDP, but also it's school-wide and with the University of Pennsylvania. We're very fortunate this year. We proposed Moses Oketch not only as this GSC provost appointee, but also as a instructor in the IEDP program. And I'm pleased to say that I was influential in that decision, having met Moses Oketch at various meetings before he came to the University of Pennsylvania. Now he was here earlier in March, as some of you know, and he's staying on through the month of June, I think it is, the end of the month of June or beginning of July, which also allows him the opportunity to meet with those of you who are on campus at other moments in other places. He will also participate on Wednesday at a special meeting of the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives on Penn's relationship with Africa, which is a multi-school effort, and he will also be involved in that. So by way of introduction, Moses Oketch received his, I guess the undergraduate degree was at University of Nairobi, and then went on to do a master's and PhD at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana in the economics of education. He since was a assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, where our dean also was teaching at the same time, and I think they crossed paths at that moment. And then went on to the Institute of Education at the University of London. And as some of you may know, the Institute of Education at the University of London is probably, at least in my opinion, the top international education, and maybe one of the top education research institutes in the world, located at the University of London. And from what I gather from Moses, it is also, he plays a very key role and has very large numbers of graduate students under his tutelage. In going through his CV, which is quite extensive, he is involved in a wide variety of issues. I guess we're going to hear today on EFA, something many of you are familiar with, Education for All, and the tension between access and quality, which I have to say is, I just came back, as some of you know, from an international education meeting in Puerto Rico, and I would say at least half the meeting was on that topic. Professor Oketch was also at that meeting and also presented at that meeting. And it's really incredible. In my mind, I was talking with some of the older people, a little in sort of my category of older folks there, and this has really been a dramatic change, a change toward trying to understand how poorest nations are doing, but also how people who are marginalized, who drop out of school, or the kinds of issues that some of us deal with in IEDP have become so central. And Moses Oketch has been one of the people that's been called upon to be part of that dialogue, part of those conversations. And I could go on. I think what I'll do is, if anybody is interested in seeing the very thick number of publications, if you don't mind, I could pass this around. People might be interested. Or is that a private document? Or, these kind of things are often on the web anyway. So I think I'll do that just so people can get a sense of the wide variety of things that Moses Oketch has done. I think I will stop there now that you've had a little bit of food. Would you like to take over? Let's get a little preliminary as well. And maybe you want something to drink?
Thank you very much.
It's really a personal as well as professional pleasure to have him speak with us and to us today.
Thank you very much, Professor Wagner, for inviting me to Penn and for inviting me for this lunch and this talk. I know I've met some of you in my course in March. I was in Puerto Rico last week and just flew in on Friday evening, trying to find a place to live, but finally I found one. And prior to that, I had been on a 9-hour flight from London to Miami, and I learned that actually I know zero Spanish, because when I reached in Miami, my English became useless. I needed to know more Spanish to survive. But somehow I managed to survive. And we were at Puerto Rico for a very good convention. Well, for the time that I'll be here in May as well as in June. And so feel free to check on me or ask any questions. I was once a student like you, maybe 10 years ago. People think I look young. I'm actually very old. I'm not young. And when I tell them I got my PhD over 10 years ago, they say, "You're kidding me." And I say, "No, don't go by the looks. I mean, I'm Stone Age nearly." So I'm very happy to be here. And today I'm going to give a talk on a very key topic. When I was asked, actually, Dan said it has to be informal. Then it moved to formal. Then it moved to formal and informal. So today you would possibly see both. You'll see a bit of formal presentation as well as informal combined. But I think he's done an excellent introduction about my areas of work. I write a lot on a number of things. And over the last 3 years,
Why don't I move you here,
over the last 3
away
years,
from your lunch,
Sure,
and
that's
I will move you closer to my lunch.
Sure, that's a good idea. Over the last 3 years, I've been involved in strengthening research capacity in Africa, actually. So I was invited by an institution there which had demographers doing research on demographic issues. But the main problem, I told them when I met them at a conference, is that there were a bunch of demographers and sociologists. So they were looking at fertility, population growth, and things like that, and also health issues. And they presented very nice regression tables and everything. And every time they controlled for education. So everything they presented, they said you control for education. And I said, you see, you're missing the point. Because education is so important in all these things you do, you need to start actually getting involved in education. So they said, well, why don't you come over and help us get involved in education? So for about 3 years, 2008 and 2011, I was splitting my time between London and Nairobi at African Population and Health Research Center. I was on sabbatical leave, and then I was on leave there for a period of time. And over that time, I led major studies in education. These were very huge studies involving millions of dollars as part of my work. Before that, I was also involved in a number of studies in the UK, one funded by the EFID, which is the equivalent of USID in the UK, which was looking at what they call zones of exclusion. And this is something we all got involved as a team, and it was led by one of the professors from Sussex. and a lot of publications have come out of that. I've also been involved in also looking at what we call the public good element of higher education, what is called rate of return. Higher education is becoming expensive, but what role does it play in development? And this has been through the work I do with Walter McMahon, who was faculty member by South Illinois, on what we call the role of higher education in knowledge societies. So something called endogenous growth, whereby the more knowledgeable society becomes, the more they open the production frontier. So that is generally about the areas that I've worked on, but I've worked in many areas, and usually at the Institute of Education I have many students, some from the US, some from other parts of the world. At any given time I have maybe 20 masters or 30 master's students, or a large class of about 50 students, so there's always a large number of students who are interested in international development discourse. So being at Penn is delightful. It's a beautiful campus in the city, and I think the students that I've met are good, and last March I had a very good engagement, and that is why I was telling Professor Wagner that I was looking forward to coming back, because if I didn't have a good experience, maybe I would be reluctant to say I want to come but it was quite delightful. So that is all about me before I can start the formal bit. So that is a bit formal, a bit informal. Let me pause and see if you have any questions that you want to ask about what I've just said. 1 minute before I move into the formal presentation.
I have a question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Are you happy being a professor?
I think it's a good question. It's a time frame question. I'd always wanted to be a professor from my early years of life, so it's not something that happened by accident. And I think it's one of the very rewarding careers in many ways, because you get to specialize in your area, and you get to research it, and you get to change the world sometimes, not in a very big way, but you get to provide the evidence and information, and you train people that go and change the world. I've got students all over the world working with UNICEF. I got an email from one in Cambodia today saying they want to recruit somebody. Do I have somebody who can be a good education program officer in Cambodia? I have one who is in Dakar now, again with UNICEF. I get so many students all over the world doing a great job in terms of improving the well-being of a number of low middle-income countries. And I think that is itself very fulfilling. So to me, when I see that and when I hear the things my students do, I feel quite happy. So I think it's only through professorship that you're able to experience that. So I'm generally happy to be a professor. I'm happy to be visited here at Penn. Okay, so if there's no other question, then I want to turn to this presentation today on achieving education for all, with a focus in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the bit that actually interests me most is the tension between access and quality. And I think the title is straightforward. I mean, when I got an email from Amina saying, Moses, what would you like to present on? And somehow I didn't think, this just came on top of my head in a second. I just said, well, I think much of my work has always been around issues of access as well as issues of quality, whether in higher education or in basic education. And I tend to see a huge amount of tension between the two, particularly in developing countries. So that is what I will talk about, provide some evidence. But in detail, I will also give you an example of a specific country. The study I was involved in Kenya, which is a longitudinal study, so it will be much more deeper with a lot of data and some insights to draw from. So let me just start by jogging your mind about how this is a big issue. This is UNESCO UIS data, which is covering a period of 10 years. And it is on enrollment, which is called net enrollment. Net enrollment is everybody of the right age in school at the right grade. And you can see how countries are doing. Overall, we would expect that primary education or basic education of 10 years should be accessible to everybody. If the world can achieve that, the world will be a better place. And I think that has been one of the frameworks of the Education for All initiative. What I want to emphasize here is you can see the graphs. If you look at the top, that is where the countries should be if you're doing very well. But there is one graph at the bottom which is interesting, and this is the one that some of my students have seen before, but it's the main bit of the discussion today. This is Sub-Saharan Africa over a period of 10 years. And this is the world average. That is where the world is. So you can see 10 years ago, in terms of enrollment, Sub-Saharan Africa was very far below the world average. So this is where the world average, which means everybody taken together, and this is where it was. And that was very worrying, and that is one of the reasons why there was a focus on education for all, to try and get this group of kids here to go up there. Where is the United States? Where do you think the United States is on this one?
At the top.
It will be at the very top. So it's way above the world average, which means majority of kids complete about basic education. So, and that is only not only the US, but a number of countries. So you can see North America and Western Europe don't have an access issue. Then you've got Central and Eastern Europe also doing very well. You've got East Asia, then you've got Latin America, you've got Central Asia, South and West Asia, then you've got Arab states, but then you've got Sub-Saharan Africa. But something else is interesting here over the last 10 years. What can you see that is interesting when you look at all these graphs? There are two graphs which are uniquely interesting. Two lines which are interesting. One of them is this one, of course, and the other one is which one? This one. So something has happened over the last 10 years for those particular regions of the world. One of the things is that Sub-Saharan Africa has made tremendous progress in terms of expanding enrollment, which means improving access. And this is as a result of EFA, which is Education for All Framework. And by doing that, it has really nearly closed the gap, but not very much. There's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done for it even to reach the world average. Remember, the world average is still here, and Sub-Saharan Africa is still here. So there's still much work to be done on access. So that is just to give you where the access problem is. So there's still a huge amount of work to be done to improve access. But at the same time, Sub-Saharan Africa has made one of the tremendous leaps over the last 10 years in terms of expanding access to majority of the kids. So that is one data which is important from UNESCO Institute of Statistics. The other one is, how do governments allocate resources to education? This is also very important because what is driving that access has to do with resources. We can also see that Sub-Saharan Africa has devoted the largest share of its gross domestic product to education. That is the total wealth of the nation, which is devoted to education. And if you look at the blue, the gray, the black ones, and the navy blue, it shows you which levels of education they're devoting the resources to. And this has implication because if you looked at this graph many years ago, you would have seen a situation where in Sub-Saharan Africa, tertiary education was getting a greater share than basic education. And that meant that only a few people who are going into tertiary education were benefiting at the expense of majority who could not actually even be able to read and write. So that was the problem. But again, the good news out of this figure and graph is that of all the regions in the world, Sub-Saharan Africa is devoting the largest amount of its GDP to education. Remember, largest amount doesn't mean it's the highest amount. I mean, the GDP of Sub-Saharan Africa is tiny compared to the GDP of the United States. But the proportion they are devoting to education tells you how seriously they are taking education. So 2.3%, which is this one here, is being devoted to education. And that is higher than all the other regions that you can see. So that is good news, which should continue, and we hope it continues, because it means that there is more money being given to education instead of defense. It also means that governments are taking education seriously. But the other graph I want to show you is this one. And this one is also from UNESCO Institute of Statistics, and it's a global graph for a number of countries. And they're clustered. They're clustered into Sub-Saharan Africa on the far right, I would say. Then Latin America and the Caribbean, East Asia and the Pacific, North America and Western Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe. Something interesting you can see from this graph here, you can see that in Sub-Saharan Africa, this is household contribution to education, and then public expenditure. How much of the education is being offered through government subsidy, which means it's publicly offered, available to everybody, and how much are parents contributing to education? When you look at primary, in Sub-Saharan Africa, 22% of the cost to education is borne by the parents. So these very poor parents are really doing a lot to improve education. But 78% is government provision. When you look at where you are, which is North America, presumably according to the data, only 11% is being contributed by parents, and nearly 90% is state provision. As you keep moving into lower secondary, you can see it's different territory, because in lower secondary, 40% of the cost to lower secondary is borne by the parents. So if you're a poor parent, definitely you're out of secondary school, because the government can only afford about 60%, and you can imagine the competition for that 60% is quite fierce. And when you move to upper secondary, again, you can see limited provision. So what you're seeing here is that parents are contributing a lot, and you can see the same also a bit in Latin America, which means that state subsidy to education is limited. And therefore, if you're a poor parent, it's going to be very difficult for you to access education. That's just another figure to let you see how things look. The hope, the presumption is that in order to have a very meaningful universal access, that this cluster here should somehow look like this cluster or this cluster, whereby more is paid for privately in tertiary education, but basic education is sort of provided for by the state. That is where we are hoping that Sub-Saharan Africa will get itself in a few years down the line. Now, this is probably the last graph that I'm going to show you, and maybe that could easily end my conversation today, because the picture tells the story that I wanted to say. But you can see there, this is based on Hanushek and Woodman, but it's dated because they also took the data from pre-K. But I think much has changed, but not significantly. When you look at those who have finished 9th grade, the dark one, Europe. Everybody here has finished 9th grade. That is North America and Europe. So it's not a big issue. Access is not a big issue. Access to basic education is not an issue of discussion in North America and Europe. I'm sure there are pockets of issues to be addressed, but generally it's not a big issue, because very large number, out of 100% of a ratio of 1, you can see they're nearly there. It's nearly perfect. Those who have dropped between grades 5 and 9, that's the second one. You can also look at it. Also nearly perfect. Those who have dropped between grades 1 and 5, you can see. And then there are those who never enroll. And when you look at it, you can again see where Sub-Saharan Africa is falling. That is East and South Africa. You can see nearly below 60%, as per the data, had actually finished grade 9 or dropped out between grade 5 and grade 9. When you look at West and Central Africa, it was the worst. So most of them had actually dropped out, just barely below 50%. And South Asia was also doing badly. And then there was Middle East and North Africa. So this also tells you how access is a big issue. So that is one side of the story, the access issue. So the question is, therefore, should we focus on access? Because if this is a problem, then we should expand access. And that is the framework of EFA, as originally constituted. But over time, as we focus on access, the issue of quality comes in. So is it access which is more important, or do we have to focus on access and quality? And can there be a tension between trying to achieve both of them, especially if in a low-resource country? And that is what I want to talk about today, based on the context of Kenya, as an example of the tension between access and quality. About 3 years ago, I was invited to go and lead education research at FHFC in Nairobi, and they had been conducting a large longitudinal survey in 2 slums and 2 non-slum areas. And this is called Demographic Surveillance Survey of over 13,000 households. Very many kids were involved, almost 14,000, were being followed every year on a number of things. Now, one of the things that happened is that this survey was started in 2000. And then in 2003, the Kenya government introduced universal basic education because enrollment was much lower. It had done very well, but then because of cost barrier, it went down. So APHRC and myself decided that actually this is a good opportunity to nest education onto their demographic surveillance, to nest an education survey onto their demographic surveillance. So they were interested on fertility, they were interested in population issues, reproductive issues, but we were interested in education. So we worked together. So one survey in the household, when you go to ask questions to do with reproductive health, we're also asking questions to do with education. And that way we were able to gather the data much more cost effectively. Now, for the education, the aim was purely, the free primary education policy of 2003 had one single aim. The aim was to expand access. In fact, when it was introduced, quality was not the issue. The president simply said, when I'm elected, I'm going to introduce universal primary education with the aim of expanding access. Something interesting about Kenya is that the education cycle is almost similar to the US. They've got 8 years of primary school, which is unusual for many countries. Many countries tend to have 6 years of primary education. Then they've got 4 years of secondary. They don't call it lower and upper secondary, but it's just called secondary. But of course, it has lower and upper secondary. And then they've got 4 years of university education. This was changed in the 1980s, but before they followed the typical British model. Now, what is most interesting is that contrary to what was expected, that when we introduced this universal primary education policy, that a lot of kids who were out of school, as well as poorer families, particularly those living in the slums, would all be accommodated in government schools, and that will actually increase enrollment. That is what you'd expect, isn't it? Because it's a universal supply side policy. It's not targeted. It's not saying, okay, I'm targeting this population group. It simply says, education is now free, but it's free only in public schools. So if you're going to a private school, it's not free. So it's free universal education, but publicly provided, which means if you are in a private school, you cannot actually benefit from the free education. The free education is implemented through a capitation grant, which is about roughly $20 or less, given to every child enrolled in a public school. So the government gives the money there, and they also pay for teachers, and they also provide money for buildings and textbooks. So that's a good thing. And the expectation was that all the parents who are burdened by the cost of education, which therefore meant that either the children are out of school, so none-enrolled at all, or they have enrolled and dropped out because of cost barriers, would now find it easy to go to school. And two, it would also be shameful for a child not to go to school when education is now publicly announced to be free. So most parents just feel the guilt that I should let my child go to the market instead of being to the school to go and sell bananas because education is now free. So the euphoria for universal education was great, and the impact was felt. And I just want to show you how it looked like based on this study in Nairobi. This study was designed in 2 slums, but then the education program decided to add 2 non-slum areas. These are areas which were, you might call in terms of economic well-being as lower middle income in terms of the economic position. So the upper bit is the slum, and the lower bit are the non-slum. The non-slum was part of my own addition to assess how the slums and the non-slums were responding to this policy. How are the parents responding? And this is data which was being collected every year from 2005, retrospectively to 2003, and asking them questions: where does your child go to school? Where was your child in school before the policy? Have you transferred school? What do you think about the policy? What is the age of your child? And so it collected that kind of information regularly every year. And I think it's still ongoing because I left them a big grant to continue with the work. But the top graph is the slums. These are 2 slums, and I hope some of you know what a slum is. They're really complex urban living environments. Very poor, I would say that. But parents value education quite a lot in so many ways. And so you can't imagine the level of poverty, and yet the hope they have for education is great. If you talk to most of them, they believe education will be the only solution out of their condition. Now, this one is the lower middle income. Most of these are professionals in some ways, teachers and people who have gone to school, and they are non-slum, so it's reasonable, but they're not really upper middle or high income area. So the idea was not really to compare them, but the idea was to find out how do these two different population groups respond to a government policy that says education is free, public free, and you go to a public school for free. Now, before the policy was introduced, a lot of parents in the slums were actually already sending their children to schools in those slums, and those schools were categorized as informal private schools. So they're not registered by the government. They could be registered as a child center or something, but they offered curriculum and there was learning taking place. And somebody like James Tooley, who writes on this, called them private schools for the poor. And what we found is that before the policy was introduced, like in 2000, about over half of the population in the two slums we were studying were actually going in this private school. So the government was not doing much. When the policy was introduced in 2003, you can see what happened. So this is proportion in private school, and the darker one is the proportion in public school, where it is free. So before the policy was introduced, nearly balanced, but by 2002 you can see more people are in private school than in public school. We don't know whether it's a supply issue, but they were not there. They were not in government school. So when the policy was introduced in 2003, parents responded enthusiastically. And you can see cost was a barrier because a huge proportion moved back into the public school. And you can see the trend continued, and so the trend continued in 2004, 2005. But as you move towards 2006, 2007, you're seeing something strange happening. That 2003 number is beginning to go back to before 2003. There's a reversal, and that is something we are interested in knowing why. When you look at the non-slums, this is the utilization of private schools, the brown bars, and the blue ones are the utilization of public schools. The policy didn't make a difference. Whether the policy was there or not, it didn't affect them. They were not affected because it didn't determine how they're schooling. A few things happened, a little bit of change, but there's no major dramatic change as a result of the policy. In fact, if you look at 2003 and 2002, the bars are nearly the same. The policy did not affect how they school their children. So it was not as relevant compared to how it was relevant to the lives of the people in the slums. So, as you continue, this is what is happening in the slums, whereby, as of 2010, they are no longer in public schools. 60% are now back in private schools. So there's universal free primary education, but the poor parents have moved away and left it, and they've gone to informal private schools where they pay some fees. And these are very poor parents. For them to say, I'm going to substitute food on the table with fees in an informal school is a hard decision. And yet they're saying, no, my child is not going to be in government school, I'm going to send my child to private school. Initially they were in government school, they responded very positively. By 2010, this is the proportion in government schools. That is the proportion that has now gone to private schools in the slums. So things are completely reversed. And the government keeps claiming the policy's success, but when we presented this data, they were shocked because we said this is household data, this is real data based on household collection. This is not school returns, which are doubted. And so the figure shows that almost 60% of poor kids have gone back into private schools where they pay some fees, and the government claims there's free universal education. So this brings into question the EFA framework. Is it working for this group of the population? Can there be a different framework, a model that can work for them? So that is one of the things that has been of interest to me. And when you look at the trend in the non-slums, you can see some change, but nothing really significant or major, drastic. The top one is the utilization of public school. The bottom one is the utilization of private schools. Of course, in a natural context, you'd have expected the reverse. You'd have expected that in FPE, this is how it should be, that the reverse should be the case, whereby more poorer parents are utilizing public provision because it's free of charge, and a bit wealthy parents can now utilize the private system. What we were seeing in this context is the reverse of the two, which is what we shouldn't be seeing in the first place. And you can see here the utilization of private schools as well as public schools for the non-poor is not dramatic. So the policy has not really affected the way they school their children per se compared to the slum environment. So that is what brought us to...
Can you take a question?
Yes, I can take a question.
On the last slide?
Yes.
And I think feel free if you want to. This is the informal side of the formal talk.
Yeah.
But before we get further on, I think it's one thing that jumps out, even though the baseline is lower in the non-slum area, you could say that between 2000 and 2010 that there's been a tripling, that is from 10%, a little less than 10, to 30% sending their kids to private school.
Yes.
All right?
I should have said that.
You could have said that.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the previous slide, which is your slum schools, you also find a growth from around, in 2004 was the lowest point, 35%, to now up to 65%, a doubling.
Yeah.
Couldn't you interpret that as saying, and maybe you will, and you could tell me to hold off till later if you want, couldn't you interpret that as saying that schooling has become so important that parents of both slum and non-slum schools are worried about public schooling and its relative to private schooling? They're willing to pay more to get more.
Absolutely right. I mean, that is the conclusion I was going to get to, because it brings in the issue of the tension between access and quality. Here is a free access, but it doesn't meet the quality that parents have in mind, and this is for poor parents as well as non-poor parents, and you can see how they are responding to that. So I'm going to get to it, but I think it's a good point you've raised. Yeah. So this is just literature that you don't need to worry about, but this study was driven by data. We didn't go out to collect this information and answer these questions. We didn't start by saying we want to see how these graphs look like, but the data was already there, and so we decided to study the data. But in the process, we were also interested to know or to explore enrollment patterns between these two population groups in relation to universal primary education. But also, we also wanted to find out what we might call within contextual poverty dynamics in terms of household level and how that affects the decisions they make. And we were hoping that would lead us to a discussion on the tension between access and quality, whereby the government announces free education, which is supposed to be access, but then parents look at it and say, well, I don't think this education is offering the quality I need, and therefore, even though I'm poor, I'm going to move out of this state education system. And so can you actually achieve universal access and quality at the same time? And we are trying to see how parents are interpreting what universal access really means and how they're responding to it in terms of the choices they're making in terms of where they're sending their children to school. So we had a number of questions. I mean, the last one is the most interesting. Is quality a factor in the shift? And what are the implications for FP? So when you look at these graphs I've shown you, is it quality that is driving parents to make this decision? And what is the implication of that in terms of universal primary education? Now, the data was rich and it had a lot of information, so we decided to look at a number of factors, binary categorical variable factor, asking parents, why do you send your child to this school versus this? What are some of the reasons? And things like that. And in the process of asking that, we gathered huge amount of longitudinal data, and that data covers almost 7 years. And some of the questions we did ask them led us to, this is the methodology, basically what I was talking to you about earlier, about how the data is gathered. But it led us to very interesting descriptive results, which was showing where different categories of parents were sending their children, or reasons why they were moving children from one school to another. And we looked at wealth of the household, and the slums are not homogeneous, they are heterogeneous. So within the slums, there are households that have got a television that is working, even a car within the slums. And within the slums, there are also houses without nothing. So it's not homogeneously very, very poor. I mean, the context looks very poor, but they're not always fully homogeneously poor. There's a bit of heterogeneity. And we looked at the household wealth. This household wealth, we created it through what we call a composite index. You ask them, do you own a radio? Do you own a bicycle? Do you have a television? How often do you eat meat? Sort of expenditure and asset ownership. And there is something created by Pritchett in economics, And on the basis of that, you can create a composite index, and then you can categorize people into quintiles of wealth, where you can say upper 20% to bottom 20% in terms of wealth. So we created that, and so we have got the poorest, middle poor, and least poor. We also looked at pupil gender. We also looked at the study sites. We have 4 study sites, 2 slums and 2 non-slums. And we looked at the kind of school they were transferring into, and there were a number of options: public to private, private to public, public to public, private to public. So basically following those curves I've shown you. And we wanted to find out what is actually driving these curves. Of course, we know that access is now a big issue. The government takes credit for it. But the parents are seemingly moving in a different direction. So why is there this tension between access and something else happening? And we are thinking it is quality which is driving this direction of movement in the graphs. And we were not surprised when we looked at our results. Some of the parents felt that access was important and they wanted a free education. About 26% of the parents that were interviewed in the study felt that they wanted free education. If it was cheap, available, it was good, and that was nearly public school. But a larger number, almost 50%, were driven by a well-performing school, discipline. Those are the things they felt were important to them. So it wasn't whether the government, if it was not available under free education, they were going to look for it elsewhere. So free education was not the most important thing for them. What was most important for them was the school performing well, was their discipline in the school, and if that was the matter, you were willing to pay some money for it. And we think, therefore, that actually there was quality issue, which was being perceived by these parents. They didn't measure it the way we measure it in academics, but the parents had a sense of what quality is. So I highlighted those 2 top ones because the rest didn't seem really as important and significant compared to the 2. So after that, we did what we call odds ratio. How do these factors interact within themselves? And this is an interesting economic statistical exercise where you have huge amount of data. And so we just ran about 9 models, and one model was to look at logistic regression, looking at about 15,597 entries. So we've got about 15,000 entries which were being followed into about 7,000 clusters. Clusters are households. So these were clusters. So it's a huge database that we were playing in, and trying to see, of all these factors, which one was the most important one in terms of determining the movement between schools. Because we were convinced the movement was a result of parents searching for better quality for education, after we had seen the descriptive statistics. And the first model just includes everything. We have model 1 to model 3, and odds ratio just tells you the likelihood or less likelihood of an event happening, whether you're going to move to private or public, and whether that is determined by your wealth quintile or not. We also did other things. Every year we checked whether your wealth quintile changed or remained the same. Was the household better off this year than last year? So if we came last year and asked you whether you had the radio, but you came the following year and you told us that the radio that I had to sell it in order to buy food, but you didn't acquire another asset, it means that your household wealth index went down. For other people, nothing changed, so the wealth remained the same. For others, it was worse. It went negative. So these are very complex demographic exercise, which economists tend to do a lot in terms of trying to find out wealth quintile for households based on household asset as well as expenditure. So we did 9 models, and I don't want to take you through the statistics, but the significant ones are the ones you can see as star, and I'll explain to you what they mean so that I can finish this presentation. But the last one is this one, which is the ninth model, which is there, which is also looking at whether you are transferring from private, informal, versus public only. So we are running a number of logistic regressions. The first one is everything. The second one is looking at a shift to private, informal school only. And the next one is a shift from informal private versus a public. And what we found was very interesting. One is that the odds of shifting or changing school decreases with increase in wealth quintile, although statistically not significant, which means it's happening randomly. So which means that if you're wealthy, you are less likely to move schools. Wherever you are, you had made up your mind to stay because you knew what you wanted. So you are pretty much fine. The odds of changing school also decreased over time. So what happened is that as time progressed, think I have it somewhere here. Those who are moving, schools are decreasing. The numbers are looking smaller. So you can see in 2005, the numbers are big, the numbers are large. Here they're becoming smaller. People have responded to the policy. They know what they want. They have decided that public school is not for me. I'm going to keep my child in the private school whether I'm poor and I can try and get the money and keep them there. That is what I'm going to do. So you can see as time is going, they've already made up their mind that they're not getting what they want in the school where they are. So by the time they're reaching 208, 209, most parents have already made their mind about the policy and whether to stay in public school or to go to private school. The other thing we are seeing is that the odds of changing school increase with increased level of parental education. So that was very interesting. But it means educated parents were searching a lot more to find out exactly where they would like their children to go, which is not surprising in its own self. There was also differences between the two slums. One was much poorer than the other one. And the poorer one had a much more movement of schools than the one that was less poor. So which means poorer parents had interpretation of what quality was, even in their own view. Most of them were illiterate, but they had a perception of what quality was. Again, the results also show that when you look at increase in wealth quintiles, the odds of shifting to private informal schools among the slum pupils also increase, but not statistically significant. So it's a random occurrence. Similarly, I think the last one before the last one there, the second last is important. Odds of shifting to a private school decrease with increased level of household head education. The age of the child also mattered a lot, whether to move the school or not. If the child was much older, the odds decreased, which means they were not going to move them to school. They stayed in the school where they were. We also looked at a number of things, the effect of household health education becoming significant only when considering changes into either private, informal, or public school. Parents who have either primary or at least secondary education were found to be more likely to transfer their children into private informal schools when compared to those with no education. The odds were almost 60 to 50% respectively. So very interesting conclusions that we drew from here. We looked at a number of things, but interesting conclusions which you can read from here. So basically trying to look at each of those sites and the issue of wealth quintile and dynamics of the different slums in relation to the policy.
Well, this is just a quick question,
yes.
Definition. Did you, maybe I missed this, the difference between, is there a difference between private informal and just private school?
Yes, there is difference between private informal and private schools. This is a big study. These are private schools. These ones here are very expensive, reasonably very expensive. They're very good schools, very nice. So these parents are not going to private informal schools, no. Those ones are private informal because they're in the slums, and some of them are not registered by government. So these are private informal. These are real private schools which are professionally run, which are registered by the ministry, and they are paying a lot of money. The upper bar are a private informal.
And I had actually thought maybe you meant that some of the private informal were supplemental schools. That's an additional kind of school, right?
They were
How about
not
after-school schools?
No. Well, no, not quite. They were purely the school where the child was going to.
Okay.
So it was not the school you go to after you come from school. It was the school where you go to. So it was only one school. So
cheaper private schools as opposed to
expensive,
more elite private schools.
Not the very elite.
Not elite.
Yeah, but still expensive and quote-unquote elite private schools.
And is there a significant difference in the quality between the elite private schools and the informal private?
Very huge. We didn't check for it, but generally you can see, I mean, the informal schools are in the slums, I mean, they look worse. In terms of infrastructure, they are much worse than public schools. I mean, that is what amazes us. How does a parent bypass this nice government school and decide that my child is going to go into this this structure, this shanty structure, which they call a school. No inspectors, nothing. But they pay some money, and that's where they want to educate their child. And they're saying, my child is not going to in public school. And when we ask most of them, they say, I think there's better quality in this structure than in the public school where they can sit down or where there's a formal teacher. And that is a conundrum. Yeah. So they're not comparable. The top ones are in the slums, really complicated context. These ones are proper schools, nearly a very good classroom, very good, well structured, better than public schools. On the top one, the public schools have got better infrastructure, better trained teachers, everything. But the parents feel that there's not much learning there compared to the informal private schools. Okay. I know there are a lot of questions that we can raise, but let me finish and then we can go into a discussion on the points I wanted to raise through this very big study. I think there's a paper on it which I can share with you later on. But these are the insights that we draw from this study in relation to while universal education has expanded access, even poor parents have a sense of what quality education is. They search for it in the so-called informal schools, or James Dewey's reference, private schools for the poor. And this is a tension. So the government on the one hand says, I want to help the poor people by providing universal free primary education. The poor parents say, well, I'm responding positively, so 2003 they come in, but quickly they feel that, no, this is not the education I want, I'm going back, or I'm going to another private informal school. And so the government is caught in between. So there is this tension between how do we achieve a universal access that is of quality, because even the poorer parents who universal primary education is supposed to help in the first place are shunning it somehow for private schools where they pay money as a result of quality. It is clear that Kenya, like many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that have introduced universal access policies, now face the tension between quality and access. That is, when access is expanded, quality is affected. And we are thinking that, as Dan, Professor Wagner said, that 30% that has moved even among the wealthy is because of, remember there were 9% a decade or a few years before the policy. By the time I was showing you, they had moved nearly threefold. So they were 30%. In the slums, they had moved to almost 60%. So it means that actually everybody is feeling that there is something here. Quality is a problem in the public system which has been expanded. And so how can Kenya government respond? The third bit, I think some of you who are in my class and those who read economics of education will have seen Hamishek and Usman vigorously argue about the idea of EFA being bonkers, sorry to use that word, but they feel that EFA is not going to deliver anything unless there is a focus on quality. And so Hamishek and Usman have continued to argue and present empirical analysis evidence that enrollment alone without learning is not adequate investment in human capital, and that educational attainment is now a bad measure of total human capital because quality is so low. So the argument is that if you continue to provide education that is of this low quality, the money is not value for money. These kids are finishing 8 years of school, but they are reading at grade 2 level. So is that really good value for money? Should the country feel proud to say we've got universal access when majority of the kids are only able to read at grade 2 level when they're in grade 8? That is a big debate. So it is not surprising, again, when you look at all this evidence, that there is clear focus and attention on early grade and literacy. Ensure that you improve literacy, and USAID is doing it, DFID is doing it. International community is actually galvanized around it. The question remains, can quality be achieved in a system that has experienced rapid access, like these countries, Kenya for example, large young population of school-age going children, and low immediate past economic growth? They don't have resources to meet all those demands. Can it be done? Can international community deliver quality when so far access has not been fully met by so many countries? I showed you the data. So when the focus now moves away from saying access, we are going back to quality. Do you think that graph that I showed you, the first graph where Sub-Saharan Africa had made progress, will that graph again stick back? Which means that we keep chasing access and quality all the time? Can we get them both? We'll focus on quality, wipe off the gains that have been achieved through EFA framework. We know for sure that there's a big issue about quality. And the example I've given you here is of poor parents shifting school because they're thinking the state-sponsored universal education is not of good quality. They're going to private school where they pay some money. And the international community is following them up and saying, you're right, we need to focus on quality. Now, do you think that 20 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we are going to wipe the gains that we saw in that crowd in Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much.
Before I open for questions, I'm going to open for cookies. Otherwise, we'll have the professor gets some cookies too.
Thank you.
For his efforts. So I'm going to pass these around. I'll start this direction. Some got the CD first, others get the cookies. Okay, so the floor is open. Please.
I was thinking more about what you said, that parents have perceptions about what quality is. And so I was wondering, when you were gathering some data and speaking to families, those that sort of elaborated on what that means to them. What does quality mean to them? What are they seeing in the slum informal schools that they're not seeing in the public schools? And did parents sort of go deeper in terms of that meaning? And two things that I'm thinking about a little bit are, I don't know, maybe it's just like a universal human behavior that sometimes we apply value to something that has a cost, right? So maybe there's just a perception that if I'm paying for this, it's more valuable or better. I'm not sure. But the other thing I was thinking about is sort of social capital. Do parents feel more comfortable within the informal slum schools, that they're more accessible, not in terms of just their child going in the classroom, but in terms of relating to sort of the school, the teachers and the school staff. So I don't know if any of those conversations came up when you were collecting data.
Very good questions. Let me answer them. Let me start with the one where you are asking, do parents really feel that when they're paying for something, it's better quality? Intuitive logic for us was that if that was the case, then the response we saw in 2 or 3 shouldn't have happened. Because this response in 2 or 3, maybe for these guys, but even these guys were never affected. They were paying for something, but even when it was meant free, they were never bought. They were these rich people here, rich imports, were fine. So they just stayed. But when you look at these parents, look at the shift, which means that, of course, they were paying for it, but we are assuming that that shift was moving into public school from private, which by intuitive logic for us was that, of course, they would value something where they pay money, but they were also enthusiastic about universal education. They took it as it is. The government didn't say that you must close all the private schools. No. They just said education is now free. Go to school tomorrow. There'll be books. You don't need to pay any money. There'll be no tuition. Because prior to that, there was some tuition that was charged in public schools. So we assumed that because there was private tuition, they were looking at the cost differential between private and public, and they felt maybe there was no difference. But then, after they moved in, from 204, 205 going onwards, we are seeing a shift. So I think maybe we did look into that, but the intuitive logic for us was that we can't tell that the parents really valued where they were paying money. But we feel that the parents had a perception of what quality was. And some of the things they raised was that they felt that their children, when they were in private schools before the policy, before they moved them to public school, were better. The children came from school showing tendencies and had learned something. Whereas when they went to public schools, that tendency was not there. Part of large class sizes, they were not communicating with the teachers. In these private informal schools, although they are informal schools, in the sense that they are not registered by the government, but they somehow felt that the children were engaged with the teachers. They were smaller class sizes. These are not classes as you can call them. These are dark, dingy houses. They're not houses, they're even structures. But the parents felt comfortable there, and they were willing to pay some money. And this money is negotiable. You can go and pay $1 today. The total cost, I think, for a term was roughly 300 shillings for a month. That's about less than $10. Yeah, about $5. So $5 was, and $5 is a lot of money. These are people who live on less than $1 a day. So $5 is what they were paying, but they could go and say, today I'll pay $1, give me another 1 month, I'll pay another $1. And in the process, the kids were going to those schools. So we don't know, but the parents had a feeling that the universal free education was not delivering quality. And the perception was based on just how they were interacting with their children and how they felt the interaction between them and the teachers in public schools was. Large classes they used to hear. My child is in a class which is very large, and The children would come back home and say, I don't feel like I'm learning in the government school. I would rather go back to my old school. Yeah.
I have bunches of questions. Why don't we start here? Well, I'll choose.
Okay.
But then Amy.
You've talked about the perception of quality in these informal private schools. Has there been any assessment of the outcomes on student performance in these informal schools? And also related to curriculum, what is the curriculum that the teachers use and the teaching methods? Because perhaps they're using more traditional teaching methods that are conducive to student learning, as opposed to in government schools where they're using more rote learning.
Good question. As a result of this evidence, RTI is now doing studies on this. They're doing studies which is built up because when we presented this evidence, the USAID funded them, and they wanted to work with HTC, but I left and I went to London, so that partnership didn't work. But they're looking at the quality issue in terms of are the kids in these informal schools learning better, which means that actually, is it the case that public schools are so inefficient that you can actually, because these schools are very low cost, by all means. And if they can achieve greater learning, then there's some story to be told. So I don't have an answer now, but maybe if you ask me in a year or so, I will be able to have the answer from Ben. But that is part of the study that we were engaged on. Following this, we decided to say, let's go and look at the actual learning taking place in these informal schools, because over 50% of the parents are sending their children there. They have shunned the state system. So that is going on now. The other discussion going on with the government, which I was involved in, but I'm now back in London and I realize how difficult it is when you're away from the crowd, was to ask the government that can they extend the capitation grant to the schools? Because if you're saying education is free, then why can't you send that capitation grant to these informal schools where the kids are? So that the money follows the kid rather than the money being sent to a particular school. But then they said, well, we can't do that because these are informal, they are private entrepreneurial ventures. Some of the guys who run these schools don't want to be part of government. When you tell them that they want to get the capitation grant, they say no. Then an inspector will come here, they'll start asking this and that and that. I just want to run my school, it's working fine for me the way it is. Keep the capitation grant. So they also don't want a formal system. And the government is saying, we can't give capitation grant when there's no system of accountability. So we can't give the grant to the schools. So there is even a bigger problem because the ones who run these schools don't want the government to be involved. In fact, parents don't want government to be involved. They want these schools to stay as they are. Whether they deliver good quality education, I don't know. We have to wait and see. But we did a study, which is published, I can share it with you. This study tracked, because we collect this data from the household level. These informal schools, in Kenya, they do an examination after 8 years. It is called transition examination. It's a summative assessment, very competitive. Out of nearly almost close to 1 million kids do it every year. And only about 30% make transition to secondary school. And that transition is purely based on how you perform in this exam. So these informal schools, they don't go up to the higher grades. Most of them are grade 1 to maybe grade 4, 5. And they end there because of reasons we don't know. But they don't go up to grade 8, etc. So what parents do is very interesting. They keep their children in these informal schools. But when they reach a higher grade, they register them in an examination center or a public school. So their name is in a public school, but they don't attend regularly. So that when the exam, because these schools cannot sit for the exam, because the government doesn't recognize them. So when the examination time comes, this child who has been going to informal school, private informal school, goes and sits for an exam in a state school or an examination center. When we did the analysis in this data, they did better than those in public schools. That's a snapshot. But we followed the key, because we've got the data from the household, so we can ask, have you ever been in an informal school? Yes. Have you been in public school throughout? Yes. When did you move from public into informal? We get the year. When did you sit for the exam? We get the year. Then we've got the exam scores from the National Examination Council. Then we match that to create a data set. When we did the analysis, those who had ever been to an informal school, did better than those who had always been in public schools. So something is happening. some learning is taking place. The curriculum, they follow the government state curriculum. Yeah.
Okay, well,
No, I can make my turn.
My question is really similar to Amanda's. I was going to ask what your impressions of the informal schools were, but you pretty much answered that, so.
okay, Nicole.
My question is, what about, did you look at total enrollment? Is it possible that in 2003, when there was a public school, that kids that weren't attending at all were the ones that made the percentage go up? And then maybe the ones that were paying switched over?
We don't know. It's a good question. I mean, it's both. But I think most of this data we're seeing is switching over. In some ways, maybe in rural areas, but we didn't find a lot of kids out of school. I mean, that is the main argument Julie has always made. That actually what happened was not that a lot of kids who were out of school came into school. That actually what happened is that there were a lot of kids who were in private informal schools who were not accounted for in the state schools. So the bulge we are seeing in public school as increased enrollment is basically simply a shift from informal private schools into the state school. And we are seeing it's going to happen as a reverse. And remember, the UI statistics which I showed you, that data, that graph that I showed you at the beginning, this graph here, this is official statistics. It doesn't include these people in the informal private schools. So this is really misleading in some ways, because this is only capturing what is official, what is happening in state schools. These informal schools are not registered by the government. The government doesn't know what is going on there. They don't know who is involved there.
What would the data look like in your guess?
I think it will go up, because these are kids who are in school, but they're now categorized as not being in school. They can't be found.
But is Kenya also, would you say, since that graph shows Sub-Saharan Africa, is Kenya a good example of Sub-Saharan Africa?
Kenya is a good example of high achieving, high enrollment.
I'm just saying, how much do you, in some ways, is Kenya a little exceptional, and that maybe that bar, I'm just asking whether that bar would change a lot if informal schooling in Sub-Saharan Africa was included, or would it, I mean, clearly in Kenya it would change a lot, but would it, how much, I'm just maybe to broaden the discussion.
Not big. The proportion of informal school provision could be about 20%, I think, across Sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah.
But one of the highest would be Kenya.
Kenya would be one of, I mean, it's higher in places where you've got large cities with large informal settlements, where you've got, Nairobi has got about 5 million people, and about more than 3/4 of that lives in the slums. So, and with growing urbanization, I think if you go to Nigeria, you'll find the same. If you go to Delhi, you'll find the same. So when you have these big urban cities which have grown very quickly and planned, a large proportion of the population live in the slums, and you'll find the informal school system very much a character of the slum rather than a character of rural schooling. In rural areas, the provision is monopolistic. So this will be representative of countries that have had a rapid rise of urbanization. But rural provision is still primarily state provision. You don't find private informal schools in rural areas. Peri-urban areas, you see some of this, but it's predominantly a large urban informal settlement phenomenon.
Okay, maybe one more question here. Oh, wow.
Okay, so you mentioned that students who had attended at some point informal schooling have higher scores on the examination, which is one way of viewing the results. But I wonder how you deal with kind of the pushback that parents investing in their students' education and being willing to spend those $5 a term or whatever it is would correlate to a higher parental involvement in the student's education, and that education takes place both in school and out of school. So if you consider that statistic and you just take it by the statistics, yes, you would assume that the informal schools are doing better, but it could just be more that the parents are investing in the students and helping them with their homework and doing things after school with them that incorporate learning. So like, how do you
Possibly, but I mean, we've got data to be able to control for parental level of education. So, of course, we know they would be interested to find out, did you do your homework? The kids are motivated because they wear some uniform. Somehow the parents motivate the kids. I think the data we've got was small enough for us to be conclusive, and I think this study by by RTI, which I was supposed to be part of, and I hope I will still be part of, because it's almost 600 schools. I mean, it's built up on this completely. Because when we presented this, that question came up, and so they have gone into a number of informal settlements across Kenya, and they're testing kids and want to find out between public and private schools, are the kids in these so-called informal private schools reading better than state schools. And I think once we have that data, I think it will be a good discussion. Yeah. But I think there could be a possibility of that correlation, that parents who are paying are more likely involved in their children's education than the ones who are not. But I don't know. I mean, for sure, I don't have a strong answer. But it's intuitively, it's a good logic.
Okay, I think that, yes, and then was there a question back there too?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take yours, and then we'll ask, we'll have them respond to both. Go ahead.
So, because education expenditures are a fairly large percent of GDP, but yet that also makes it a target for cuts eventually, and I think your argument is that the return on investment in quality probably outweigh return on investment for access. So how do you convince the policymakers where the money should go based on studies like that?
Good question.
Yeah. I wanted to find out if you factored in distance of these private and public schools from the locations of these places from which they had to travel to. And secondly, how about teacher standards? Is it the same across both public and private?
Good questions. Just to correct, I'm not actually Hanushek, so I'm not actually saying that investment in quality education is the way to go. I mean, I'm more of the person like Brett who argues that good attainment and quality should go hand in hand. But what I'm presenting here is basically the tension of trying to achieve both. Now, you are asking a question that I think policymakers, everybody doesn't have an answer yet. How do you achieve this? It's complex because I think the first generation or 2 or 3 will have to contend with some mediocre level of education. And the government has to be willing to stay on course with the hope that that will be picked up in the next generation. However, the challenge will also be that they ensure that the mediocre level of education doesn't feed into the teaching system, so that the teachers, that is my own opinion, that those who are selected to be teachers will be able to mitigate the present conditions of low quality education in the next generation. So it's a catch-22. These countries are poor, unless the international community actually just goes in with money, and there's also a lot of wastage. In Kenya, for example, about 40% of the money in public schools is corrupt, is taken up by the officials. So the budget is great, but much of that budget is, they just saw it as where they can now get money, and it's in a big scandal. So this huge budget to education is also feeding into huge corruption. So maybe if that corruption was dealt with, we could actually see greater efficiency within the public system, and therefore maybe quality can be achieved. But if that is not possible, then my own position is that I think we should not abandon the access debate. In fact, at the moment, there is little discussion on access. The international community has shifted, has moved away from access. The discussion today, as we speak, is on improving learning, its quality. My fear is that 10 years down the road, we'll come back and say we need to go back to access, because it's been a pendulum for a number of years. And that is why I was showing the graph from UNESCO statistics, which is showing you how this has been happening over the years. And I think the effort should be to have these two carried along, but with a caveat, with clear knowledge that we are not going to achieve 100% quality. How about this quality? 20%? Can we raise it to 40%? And we'll be happy with that. But we're going to raise it to 40%, but we ensure that access is 100%. But then we know that once access is 100%, it is going to have multiple effects, because one of the problems in this country is also a population dynamic issue. When you've got a lot of children, one household with 6 children, 7 children, 8 children, and the poor, then you've got a rolling effect. And that sort of domino effect will be dealt with when the first generation is gone. And hopefully, population debates also lead to lower small house, lower population size. So that in the next phase, you've got the right number of children, with a smaller population that you can offer the quality. But I think that to simply shift over the debate completely to quality, as Abhishek is arguing, would be wrong. To ignore it is also wrong. So it's a balance. So if you ask me if I was a Minister of Finance, which I don't want to be, I would simply give all the money to education and don't give any money to defense, or some to defense. The US can deal with all the defense issues. Follow the Canadian model, be clever and say, if my neighbor is powerful, I don't need to spend my money being careful. I need to spend my money in education. So if some of the countries were clever, they would be clever enough to say, well, if I have a strong neighbor who is spending all their money in defense, I don't think they'll attack me. I'll spend all my money in education. But it's a difficult balance. But it's the tension that I'm talking about. How do poor countries achieve access and achieve quality at the same time? We have seen that population is a major issue. Economic growth has to be part of it. And Latin America is a good example that has done that. And I think when you look at Latin America, they didn't actually say we are going to go for quality and ignore access. Latin America is a good example. They're moving towards greater quality, but they've also ensured greater participation over the time.
Okay, so I realize you didn't fully answer the gentleman's question, the last question, but we have to wrap this up at 1:30 due to other things happening. So I'm just going to say thank you very much. You raised, I think, for us, I think it's good for those of us in the schools who are studying international education. It's very healthy for us to understand that there aren't simple solutions, that it isn't going to be one way or the other. And this is a very good example of us trying to come to grips with these different tensions. Tension's a good word, I think, for us. So I want to thank you again, Moses. This was very interesting, and we'll look forward to updates over time. Thank you very much.